And with the rising global inflation fueled by rising energy costs, most parts of Africa have large populations with little or no access to reliable energy sources. But how do we bridge this gap? Joining me now is Chinan Dikwal, energy expert and vice chair, African Energy Council. Join me via Zoom. Great to have you on the show.
Pleasure. Very good pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I know that you're at the Nigeria International Energy Summit. That's kicked off on Sunday. What has been discussed so far?
Thanks so much for the question. So, yeah, I mean, the summit kicked off on Sunday. It is the Nigerian International Energy Summit. It's the flagship, summit for Nigeria as a state. It's also a lot of policy issues were discussed. We had lots of heavy hitters in there. So we had ministers all across the board around Africa, lots of captains of industry being around to talk about policy, but Nigeria's place within all of that. I think one of the themes that's coming up very, very clearly is around humanizing energy. And it's such a big thing for Nigeria. Humanizing meaning, putting people at the center of energy decisions. So one of the things, you were just talking about with your guest was around subsidy, subsidy removal, all of that critical thinking around how do you humanize energy if you're making a critical decision? Does it impact? Who are the critical stakeholders, that will be affected by this? And therefore, what are the steps that you take to ameliorate any, challenges to them? So lots of things were discussed. I think this morning we're going to have His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Vice President. He's going to be there, I think, from about 11 o'clock this morning. But outside of that, a lot of very critical stakeholders from around the world, all discussing, sort of energy dynamics and Nigeria's place within that.
And talking about Nigeria's place in all of this, now we've had this summit for years now. Can we gauge the impact so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yes, we've had this summit. I think this is the third year running, if I'm correct, probably second. But yes, we've had the summit for a while. I think what this summit is doing is it's consolidating much of Nigeria's oil and gas efforts across everything, across upstream, midstream, and downstream into one. And a lot of the policy discussions, the action points, are what are feeding policy in the Nigerian state. So we talk about the petroleum industry bill that came out. Lots of the inputs from these kind of discussions end up feeding into that. Some, not particularly on this one, but we've seen big announcements in some conferences where companies will come and make big announcements of capital spend for the year. We're starting to see that here as well. So to your point, there, can we gauge the impact? I think 150%. We're starting to see that, in this conference, discussions and some of the initiatives that are coming out are, driving the agenda within the Nigerian state, especially so actually around the energy transition and sustainability.
We did get some data recently from the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It revealed that Nigeria has lost about 619.7 million barrels of crude oil that's valued at 16.25 trillion naira. That's the crude oil theft. Now, between 2009 and 2020, quite a staggering number there.
It truly is unfortunate, what's happening within the industry. We have a lot of leakages that need to be plugged. And I think by far this is the biggest one. Now, just to be very clear, so the number you mentioned, I think is 619 million barrels in total. Now, to put that in context, Nigeria's oil production, month of March of 2023, I think was roughly 1.3 million barrels per day. So if you put that in context, 1.3 million barrels per day, compare that to 619. That's a colossal number. I think if you do the math, I think probably around 500, roughly maybe 480 days. So essentially what that means is Nigeria has almost lost oil production for 180 days. 1.2 million barrels compared to 690, almost lost oil production. It's almost akin to losing oil production for a year and a half. It truly is staggering when you think about it. The number you mentioned, 16 trillion naira, maybe around 40, probably 48, 47, billion dollars. It's a huge number. And the reality of it is for crude oil theft to be happening at this scale, it's not simply a thing that's artisanal. So it's not artisan play. It's not a thing of having illegal refineries. It's not small players in the game. This is an industrial operation of theft. It's industrial, and for that to happen, I can guarantee you, key operators would have to be involved because we're talking about massive theft of crude oil. They have to be involved. Whoever is policing or guarding that area, the whole area, they would have to be involved. And, even in the international stage, because much of the crude that's stolen from here ends up on the spot market. It ends up in the spot market, in Europe and all around the world. So there would be lots of foreign players as well. So it's a whole operation that traverses a massive cross section, and it requires lateral thinking. It needs us to think differently about how we attack this problem. It's not just rhetoric. It's not just clamping down. It's not what the Navy is doing. The Navy would go in and they would find an illegal, vessel, and they would destroy it. You don't destroy these vessels. We hold those vessels. We ask questions, and we're trying to find out exactly who's behind that, and then that's the basis that we take that forward. You don't just burn the vessels. We need to think laterally about this problem, because what's happening here, unfortunately, is burning the future of our kids, the future of the generation to come. This is oil, and it's a lot of money.
And definitely, this is a time where we need all the revenue, that we can get. And, talking about, spending, we spent about 13 trillion naira now on fuel subsidies. That's between 2005 and 2021. And now it looks like removal is upon us, that subsidy removal. What would you say is the best way to get a soft landing, for this transition?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting one. It's one that's very close to my heart. The reality of it is, fuel subsidy, the concept of fuel subsidy, it's a good thing, and it serves the general population. If you execute that properly, then without a doubt, what you'd find is when you go to the pump to fill in petrol, you'd be really cheap. When you go to the pump to fill in petrol, there will be petrol. You will not be out. You wouldn't have all the queues that we're having if you execute that strategy properly. Unfortunately, like you said there, since 2005 to date, all of these parameters have failed. We've been paying huge amounts, 74 trillion naira, like you say, around fuel subsidy. And you go to the pump, there will be no fuel. You go to the meter, relatively expensive compared to the Nigerian situation. What that means is most of the money being paid for fuel subsidy does not translate to the ordinary people on the street. It ends up servicing the people who are importing this fuel themselves. So the selected few are the people who benefit from that. It's a colossal amount of money. We're talking billions and billions of dollars, probably about $74 billion from the last count. I think that we had at the African Energy Council, $74 billion of fuel subsidy from 2005 to date. So the whole thinking here is, if all of that money does not translate to the ordinary person, why do we keep paying it? And I think that's the rationale here that government is thinking, to remove that fuel subsidy and come up with a different mechanism that serves people better. So I think if you listen to Zainab Ahmed's comment, the finance minister, what she was saying there was, well, hang on, we're going to, from June of this year, June of 2023, we're going to stop this fuel subsidy program. We're going to come up with I think a facility from the World Bank of 800 million, I think something like that's $800 million. And what they would do with that is they're going to give that money to about 10 million homes. Now, that in itself is a problem because, who are these 10 million people that you give? How have you identified the 10 million people? Do you have a database of the, poorest 10 million people in Nigeria? How would you, all of those questions come into play? But without a doubt, the thinking is good thinking. It's actually now to the implementation. How do you make that happen? That's the key one. And I think the other thing they're talking about is that they would provide mass transit buses in each state. That sounds like a good idea. But again, it goes back to the whole thing. How do you make that happen? Who's going to procure them? Who's going to run it? Who's going to operate?
Right.
We have a plan for them to still be here in 3 years and 2 years, and when they break down. All of those questions come into fray. But without a doubt, if you ask me my personal opinion, I think the fuel subsidy removal is long overdue. There will be short-term pain.
All right, I guess we all have to go
Each of us
through.
will feel that pain, but I think without a doubt,
Yeah, we have to go through that pain at some point. But thank you so much. We'll keep tracking discussions at the summit and conversations there. Thank you so much, Chinan Dickwal, energy expert and vice chair, African Energy Council. Thank you.